Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Zero Trust Identity Administration and Resilience. We've got a great presentation prepared today to talk about implementing and sustaining enhanced security measures that are so crucial to AD security right now. So let's get started. I'm McKenna. I work alongside the Microsoft experts here at Cayosoft. Just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everyone has the optimal listening experience, but we do encourage you to ask any questions you may have. So depending on how you join today, either in browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section in your meeting dashboard. Feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time today, we'll make sure to reach out to you individually to follow up. While you're in your meeting dashboard, also make sure to check out the handout section. We've included some additional resources there that you can download and share with your team. This session will also be recorded and we'll email you a link in the days following. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be sharing our contact information. So if you have any additional questions or are watching this on demand, please feel free to reach out. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be drawing one lucky winner of a $50 Amazon gift card. So make sure to stay on the line until then as we draw from the list of those present at this time. Now that we've got all that taken care of, let's go ahead and jump in. With us today, we have the founder of Cayosoft, Robert Bobel. Bob is one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery. And with more than 25 years of experience in the Microsoft identity industry, he has tons of insight and best practices to share. So you guys are in great hands today. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Bob.
Hey, thank you very much, McKenna. I appreciate the nice intro and the nice words. I thought we'd start off here today simply just giving you a quick overview of who we are at Cayosoft and why I originally founded this company. So in early 2013, we decided, my partner and I, there's a second founder, Andre, we decided that the enterprise Active Directory customers that we had for the organization we were working for at the time were really not prepared to embrace the next generation of IT solutions, which were cloud-based applications that would supplement your on-premise Active Directory and Exchange environment. And so with hybrid, cloud first, and security, and don't forget efficiency in mind, we decided that there was an opportunity to create a new set of tools that would allow us to serve that niche that we knew that Microsoft and existing vendors weren't going to serve. The first thing I want to mention about Cayosoft is that all of our software solutions are hybrid ready. We take a hybrid approach to each one of our products. So the products actually work both on-premise and against the cloud Microsoft platforms. And we also have some capability around other platforms as well, like Google and Amazon. We really focus on security and making those operations or the implementation of security very, very efficient for IT teams, so that even though you add a lot of additional policies and measures, hopefully we reduce the administrative burden that goes along with that and the 90% additional admin burden that hybrid itself brings along. We have 99% customer retention and we have 4.5 stars out of 5 for our customer support. So the statistics that we have are almost unmatched in our industry. Now that we've kind of gotten the marketing piece out of the way, I guess the marketing people will be happy. Let's talk about why we're here. Well, Active Directory and Azure Active Directory are critical components in the majority of enterprises around the world. I've heard from Microsoft that something like 98% of enterprises, business enterprises or not-for-profits, or other types of educational or governmental institutions, 98% of them worldwide use Active Directory to store their user accounts and to perform their access checks. So we were interested to kind of know what would happen if those directories failed and you couldn't use the identities that were stored there. So we worked with Gartner Group, a very large US-based consulting company that does global research on IT topics and provides IT governance and direction. What would happen if Active Directory failed and the organization had an outage? And so they did a survey for us. It wasn't just one question, it was a bunch of questions, but this one was, I think, most appropriate for this particular seminar. What are the top 3 impacts should your Active Directory fail? What would it cause in terms of concern or damage to your organization? And this was multiple choice. They had 5 choices. And the number one choice, or had the largest number of votes, was that the organization would cease to operate, which may then lead to being in a situation where the company goes out of business and no longer exists. The second one was just a simple loss of revenue, simple, meaning, hundreds of millions of dollars. And then finally, the third most popular item chosen was loss of critical data because they couldn't keep up with production information or the storage of data or cash register transactions or whatever it might have been. And so that kind of goes to, hey, you're out of business, right? You can imagine a large US retailer or a global operation that does shipping going out of business for just even, an hour, how much that would actually cost. So the outage has costs and losses, but the most important thing here is that basically everybody said the organization would cease to operate, which means they're out of business for the time the directories are down. But it'd be nice if you had prevention in place that kept the outages from occurring in the first place. And I'd like to now sort of relate this back to zero trust, because guess what? Zero trust is one of those ways you can prevent those outages. And it also brings up a very, very good point. There are some assumptions that you adopt along with the zero trust model that really make this concept of an outage front and center and getting you prepared not only to defend against having one or preventing one, but then also recovering from one as quickly as possible so you can get back into business, get back, to operating. You minimize the amount of lost revenue and lost data that you might incur due to those outages. So now we were talking also with Gardner, and another question we asked is how many people were cloud only, how many people stepped away from Microsoft as they went on their cloud journey, and how many people were hybrid or still just on premise, not using cloud. And the surprising result was that hybrid is the new de facto standard. There are more organizations that are in hybrid than any other method of deployment of Microsoft technology. So of course they had on-premise Active Directory. These were the original targets we had. 2% said they moved away. So we assume they went to Google or went to Amazon, and they weren't really using Microsoft's directory, maybe some other directory service out there. I know Okta has sort of a directory service. They were actually the victims of an outage recently. They could have used our tools to save their environment, but that's a different story. 2% remained on premise or were planning on remaining on premise. 17% moved to Azure completely. That's a very small number, by the way, if you kind of look at the scheme of things. And again, these are enterprises. These are not, a 5-employee flower shop or a 35-employee manufacturer. These are larger organizations. I believe they were above 500 or above 1,000 employees. So these are definitely enterprise-sized people that were interviewed for this. A portion of those folks, about 25% of them, said they eventually would like to go cloud only, but they didn't know for sure how long that would take because they had a lot of legacy applications preventing that. And then more than half said they're going to be hybrid for the foreseeable future. So when you add those two together, how many are actually, you get about almost 80% of organizations today are in hybrid mode. And of that, roughly half are trying to go cloud, the other half just plan on being in hybrid. But zero trust model is critical for securing hybrid environments because hybrid really starts to illustrate the reason zero trust is so important. Before, when Active Directory was just on premise, everything within your network perimeter was fairly secure. Now your perimeter is stretching out to Microsoft's environment, whether you're using VPN technology or ExpressRoute. But then you have to realize with the pandemic and all these other things, they're forcing people to work remotely. Your network security perimeter now is actually broken. It's no longer the network itself. It's those users who are, using their home laptops to communicate with your corporate resources. And so you have to understand that hybrid is really a first and perfect example of when that security perimeter starts to expand. And so that's one of those big tenets that's driving, or one of those big, we call them pillars, driving zero trust. Most organizations look at zero trust as being not just what we're going to talk about today, which is 1/6 or 1/5 of the problem, but also includes a lot of other things related to your network security, the devices and how they're looked at. There's quite a few additional options. We're going to concentrate primarily on the identity aspects of Zero Trust. So this is the environment. Why is security of this so important? Well, we know outages are critical. What else is going on in the world that really makes Zero Trust more important than ever today? Breaches are a very common thing you're hearing about. This goes back to 2020, and you'll see here we have just a small handful of these, but effectively these breaches are happening each and every day. And we really hear about the really large breaches, but most of these organizations do not implement this zero trust model to secure their networks. And so this is just getting worse and worse. Active Directory on premise, and as we saw with the Okta attack, Azure Active Directory, both of those are now under heavy cybersecurity penetration. They're really very easy targets in some cases because people haven't spent enough time to secure them properly, and then they don't have good best practices, which Zero Trust is designed to assist with or give you guidance on how you should go about doing these things. So for us at Cayosoft, Zero Trust really starts with identity. And across the bottom of the screen, you'll see that Microsoft's Zero Trust model, also the very first step they show there on the left next to the Zero Trust, a little badge that they've produced, is getting your identities secured and monitoring those. You'll see the other ones that Microsoft recommends. We do see like NIST has 6 pillars, I think, in theirs, basically 6 bubbles in their approach. GSA, which got hit several years ago with an Active Directory attack that exposed anyone who has done a federal security clearance. All of their fingerprints, I believe, now are in China. It was a state actor, which they traced it back and they blamed China for it. But again, they now are fully on board with Zero Trust. And I think theirs had 5 pillars or 5 areas. So I can't tell you that Zero Trust is an exact thing. Some people break these 5 pillars or 6 pillars into 7 even. So but really, for what we're talking about, identity is really the first step in trying to implement security and monitoring so that you don't have breaches and outages. And that's really where we concentrate on this. So we do have some other things for your endpoints and things, but we'll mention those as we go along. Microsoft or Google, they're really providing the infrastructure, the network, and then you have other components like Microsoft's Windows platform or Apple providing endpoints, et cetera. And then you have all sorts of on-premise, on local devices and cloud-based applications and data. So we're going to focus in this particular session on securing your identities and making sure that they're protected. We're going to look at identities as untrusted entities. And once you start sort of taking that approach, you really start to realize that anybody connecting to a resource could potentially be a bad actor, or the device they're connecting with potentially could be compromised. So you really want to treat all those connection requests or those authorizations with suspicion. You definitely need to monitor all the changes. And what we're going to talk about today will likely illuminate your opinion of event log tools. They're invaluable. You have to have them, but there are some problems with those. And you want to be able to set alerts and watch for certain events or certain occurrences or patterns that should be investigated further. So looking at those things is going to become critical to really looking at Zero Trust as a whole. And then even though we like to think Zero Trust would solve every problem, you still have to prepare for the worst case scenario. So the 3 tenets or 3 pieces of the Identity Zero Trust initiative that we're going to talk about is Zero Trust on identities. But the very first step is to talk about verifying every request explicitly. So that means making sure that as people make requests, they're allowed to make those requests, if you want to think of it that way. And there's a whole series of components to that, and we'll dig into that when we get to a couple of the slides a little bit later on in the presentation. So now let's turn our attention to talking about specifically Zero Trust identity administration. This is sort of the way we describe that first section, what you should do to ensure that you're securing your identities and the access that they claim as being correct and that they may try to exercise. A little bit later on, we'll also talk about Zero Trust and identity resilience, which is how you would respond, assuming there was a breach, respond to that breach or that outage to get back to a whole state. So, a couple of things about zero trust. The cool part for people is they've now been sort of awakened. I can't tell you the number of times that I've talked to IT directors and asked, how are you backing up your Active Directory? And they come back and say, oh, well, we don't. We have this manual process, and then I said, do you test it? Well, taking a different approach of when we get compromised, not if we ever get compromised, is a tenet of zero trust. You're supposed to assume there's been a breach or that there's a breach in progress. And so you need to worry about each and every place that could affect. So don't assume everything is safe within your corporate network. That's a key tenet of zero trust. Assume that there's already somebody out there, an advanced persistent threat, or maybe just a disgruntled employee. Both of those could be, equally as dangerous if you're not really on the ball. So you want to monitor everything. You want to monitor your users, monitor their access. You need to be monitoring the security settings, like your directory settings, your security policy, who's got what roles, are they using those roles, etc. And unfortunately, the event logs are not enough. I can point to a very specific change that a global administrator can perform as a Office 365 administrator. The global administrator can go in and actually elevate or escalate their privilege without being logged, without being tracked, moving them from a global administrator to a tenant-wide administrator in Azure, which means your Office 365 global administrators now can manage your VMs, your applications that are not part of Office, the whole kit and caboodle. And that's something very, very dangerous. So keep in mind that you can't just rely on event logs. There's just not enough there. And also, if somebody's breaching your environment, one of the things they're going to do before they do any nefarious stuff is going to try and blind you. So they're going to try and wipe out your event logs or tamper with them so that you can't see what else they're doing, right? That's a key piece to how breaches typically work. And so those threat actors will spend a lot of time making sure that they cover their tracks. So be prepared to recover from a breach. I think that's what we have to do, and assume one's there and go about finding those or looking for those, and then also doing things to harden your environment so that your environment's more resilient, because that'll lower the impact of any kind of breach. And if there is a breach that results in an outage, be prepared to recover from that outage as quickly as possible. As we saw, most people believe that it will stop your business from functioning and cost you a lot, and you'll lose data. So here's another great thing to mention about zero trust. One of the things that they highly recommend is implementing a least privilege delegation model. And so for many systems, that is simply direct permissions that are granted in the operating system or in the directory. Unfortunately, those are very, very hard to manage, to control. There just aren't a lot of tools out there from Microsoft or even from other vendors that gives you a good way to manage that on an ongoing basis. So first of all, don't use native permissions if you can avoid it, because they're usually not granular enough, and anybody with access to your directory could make changes there to those security permissions. And you need to be very, very careful with that, since we know that that's one of the fundamental ways people compromise the directory environments. So realize up front that native roles and native permissions are typically not a good thing to be assigning to people because of their difficulty, the lack of visibility, and they're not granular enough in many cases. And the native permissions will allow people to perform a task, but they don't control how those tasks are performed. And so people can, exercise their native permissions in ways that you might not anticipate. So for example, if you give somebody a role that allows them to manage users, it may be that they can go in and change the account in ways that you didn't expect, like turning off multi-factor, or going in and allowing the password to be clear or blank or what have you. So you have to be very, very careful and really an expert in those in order to use them. So I just suggest not using them. Second item is really important. Those roles and group memberships or permission sets that are granted, remember that they only control what somebody can do, not how they can do it. And you can use them to control where they can perform them, but it's very difficult to sort of track that with inheritance and some other things that sort of get in the way. So I just recommend avoiding native permissions, and then avoid things that give people those uber permissions, those super privileged level of combined rights. So minimize privileged group membership or the use of those privileged groups. So, if somebody doesn't absolutely 100% need domain admins, or in the Azure side, global administrators, don't give it to them. I mentioned earlier there's an escalation of privilege that global administrators can perform, gives them tenant-wide access. You don't want to give those things. Definitely for your administrators, make sure that they're using multi-factor authentication. That's either where you use a app-based token, or they text you a number, or they call your phone and verify that you're trying to authenticate or log in. And then I also recommend considering a split account model for your administrators. So they have one day-to-day account that they use with their email, et cetera. And then they have one account that they're going to use in association with making administrative changes or doing administrative work. But least privilege is definitely the model that was suggested throughout the late 90s, 2000s, up to today. But this is a big part of that framework. And a lot of people just don't realize it's virtually impossible to do it with native tools. It's very, very difficult. So the goal of least privilege also really boils down to what people do with those privileges that they're granted. And so the idea is to really not just implement least privilege, but that's sort of how they're suggesting you control change. But really the goal is to have zero uncontrolled changes, right? You don't want people going out and performing changes you don't expect. And if they can, then you need some way to go back and remediate that, maybe roll back the change and then go and implement some additional security settings that prevent that change from happening in the first place. So there are a couple things that a lot of you have probably heard about, but really what we're going to talk about are some mechanisms and systems that allow you to control who, what, and where changes can be made. So first and foremost, I recommend that you centralize your administration, right? So you don't let everybody in your IT admin staff go to each and every domain controller and start making changes. You really likely need to implement a 3-tier architecture where changes are centrally made, they're analyzed, and you can apply a policy enforcement point. And the way you enforce those things at a single point is you use role-based delegation, right? Role-based delegation is a very good way to determine what people need to do. There are lots of solutions out there for role-based delegation, but it is really designed to simplify the administration of permissions, so much so that Microsoft has added roles to Azure Active Directory so that you can control a list of tasks to control, this person has this role and this role grants them these permissions. It's very explicit, may still not be granular enough in some cases. So you may look for an alternative role-based system, but roles allow you to control who and what people are allowed to perform. There's another item called rule-based controls or rules or policies that you can implement. These are not like exchange policies, right? Where it controls where the email goes or what email is accepted or not. These are administrative or business rules that really control how tasks are to be completed. So a role grants people permissions to perform individual tasks, very granular, very easy to review the roles to understand what a particular person can do in your environment, tasks they can start. Roles are a little bit better than groups in that groups typically have permissions assigned to the group at the resource. Roles have the list of permissions that a user gets in the role, and then when they approach the resource, the role is evaluated in context of the user. So the permissions go with the role. In the traditional model with group-based privilege groups, the permissions are on the resource and they just tag the group member as or the group as being available for that particular set of permissions, which means when you get to the resource, they look to see what groups you're a member of. If you happen to be a member of an authorized group, then you get those permissions that group is authorized to allow. With roles, you carry the role with you, and the role determines what permissions are, and those are centrally stored. So again, role-based delegation is critical. Rule-based control is also critical, And rules allow you to define things like the format of a phone number you're putting in, or acceptable values for attributes, or automatic population, and then let people just do a selection to pick one or two items off of a multi-value attribute, things like that. Maybe once you've completed user creation, in the background, rules automatically dictate based on your attribute choices. Do they get a mailbox in the cloud? Do they get a mailbox on premise, et cetera? So those rules are critical for controlling how a particular task is performed. And they can also be used, as I mentioned, to do automation or orchestration of tasks. And then finally, administrative scopes is something that just sort of happened naturally when you're talking about sort of legacy security models. But where or over which objects can somebody exercise their roles, right? That's a real key thing. In on-premise Active Directory, it was oftentimes an organizational unit, an OU, a little folder. You'd go in and define permissions for a group on the folder. Those don't exist. OUs do not exist in Azure Active Directory. They have administrative units. Administrative units allow you to group things, but they don't provide things like separation of duties. So it's very tough to control administrative units that are, for example, divided up by department. You might have department level policies you want to implement, and you only want a particular user to see users within a department. Well, oftentimes in businesses, you can be in only one department at a time. Administrative units have no way of separating that. So Joe could be in the engineering department, and Joe could also be in the sales department, right? So there's no separation of duty of those in the cloud. On premise, it was naturally done because you could only be a member of one OU at a time. So be careful with administrative scopes, understand the differences on premise and cloud, and then finally use temporal group memberships or temporal role memberships. So only put people into groups or privileged groups or roles during the duration that they need to make a change, automatically remove them at specific times. And then there are also something called candidate memberships, which we'll mention here in a moment, which means are they even allowed to be in those roles based on other criteria or in that group? Even if the group has a time limit, maybe I'm only allowed in there for 3 hours. It has to be within a change window. This would prevent me from ever being the group. So don't allow a member of the janitorial staff to be in domain admins group ever, because it's not appropriate for their role within the organization, or be a member of the global administrators ever, because again, it's not realistic that they would have that as part of their role within the organization. Temporal access. This is definitely where we were starting that conversation. This sort of concludes. The key with providing delegated access is that you use roles, rules, and administrative scopes to determine what commands can be executed by a particular user, how those commands are executed, what are the parameters along the way as they're performing their tasks, and then finally, over what portion of your identities can they perform those tasks. And as I mentioned, there's things like separation of duty that come into play. You have to be careful there. There's quite a bit to that, but it is doable. So just keep that in mind. Roles, rules, and scopes are very doable. You just have to take your time. And of course, I'm always going to be a proponent of looking at third-party tools for those things to just make sure that you have the best security posture for your administrative tools and also the most efficient posture. So let's talk about how we get to zero surprise changes. Well, a first part is implementing least privilege, roles, rules, and scopes. But as people are performing those tasks, there is a possibility that you missed a rule or that one of the roles you had was over permissioned. So we don't want surprise changes because that tells us we didn't anticipate somebody was going to do something that they were able to ultimately do that may be adverse. It may be perfectly fine as well, but if you didn't expect it, that's, you just don't want surprises. So continuous change monitoring and alerting is critical here. You want to monitor everything as people are performing tasks. We really want to be careful there to examine those frequently. And if there are things that we know that should never happen or that you want to zero in on and really keep a close eye on, obviously real-time alerting is pretty critical. So you're going to want to watch your privileged accounts and changes to those accounts. You're going to watch security changes or different native rights or native permission changes. Those are all really critical. I would look for things like password resets for administrative accounts, all those types of things that are part of a potential or pending breach. So roles and rules are sort of a way to grab a set of permissions for somebody that you're going to want to grant them either for an indefinite amount of time or just in time. You want to also look for the possibility to enforce member candidacy. And so what member candidacy allows you to do is look at a group or a role and then apply conditions to membership, very simply. And so when an administrator goes to add Joe to a group, there are additional conditions that can be looked at to determine whether Joe should be eligible for those groups. Membership eligibility is another term that's out there for this. But the idea is to use the data at hand that's most likely going to be your directory attribute data. And so you now have, Joe has to be in IT operations. They must be a member of this administrative unit or this OU, and it should be specific job title and maybe a certain access code in the directory data. Now, here's where it gets really interesting because that data is subject to manipulation by administrators. So you want to make sure you have roles and rules to control how those data elements are managed. And again, you can even apply those over a scope. So if Joe is in the sales department and shows up in the sales scope or the sales admin unit or sales OU, Joe must have department name of sales. If you want Joe to be eligible to be in administrative groups, then Joe must have a department name of IT or engineering, whatever you call it in your particular group. And so you're going to want to have roles and rules over those so people can appropriately change them and use data manipulation to escalate their privilege or allow them to become candidates for groups or roles that they should never be considered for because of their status within the organization. Consider temporal access to groups. There are two real things that we typically associate with temporal access, temporal meaning time-based. One is time limits. So if you're put into a specific group that allows you to manage servers or perform some kind of application maintenance, maybe we want to restrict how long you can have that permission for an hour or two. So you make a request to be put in the group, you're in the group, you're in there for 2 hours. If you start to run over, a good temporal access system should allow you to extend your time or make a request to extend your time. But that gives you sort of a two key or a two switch possibility where there's somebody who's ultimately responsible for that resource and can approve your access to the role or group and then approve your extension, or naturally it should just deny. Then it should just remove you from the group so that you don't have that permission. The other type of temporal access is where I don't necessarily want to constrain them to 2 hours. Maybe I want to constrain them to just being able to have those permissions during weekend hours when we have change window time. So, you can only have that on Saturday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. That way we don't see administrators after hours going in and making these types of adjustments to critical accounts or groups or whatever it might be. We mentioned already before, consider separate accounts for administrators. That does make it easier and makes it easy to find those. Be careful with your naming convention, because if I can scan your Active Directory and I know that all your privileged accounts start with ADM, it gives me a really good way to start looking for those. So I probably would use something else to identify your administrative accounts. And then always make sure that you require anybody accessing your systems to use MFA, and make sure you disable legacy authentication mechanisms so that you don't have people coming in that can't be forced to use MFA. So one of the most popular ways that people breach your environment is because the desktops have some issues. Windows desktops, Apple desktops, whatever you're using, they pretty much all have a similar set of potential things that can be compromised. And once you get a hold of a lower privileged account, maybe just an end user account and a workstation, if they have local administrative rights, and if they have this, and if they have that, they may be able to extract administrative passwords from that machine. Once they have those passwords for that machine, they may be able to hop or move what we call laterally to your directory or to other machines. And so those local passwords become a real issue. Local access to an endpoint is very difficult and one of the leading causes of these breaches, driven by lateral movement. And so Microsoft came up with this tool called LAPS, Local Account Password. And LAPS allows you to have different administrative passwords for every workstation. It's stored in Active Directory and there's security applied to it. So you determine who can look at the password in Active Directory. And once they retrieve it, then they can log into those machines remotely. And so it makes it a very nice sort of password vault, if you want to think of that, for local machine credentials. Otherwise, people typically will have the same name. It'll be called PC admin, and then they'll have the same password, 123, and then they use some up-down letters formation on a keyboard. And all those can be easily guessed over time. And so by scrambling those and having different passwords, unique passwords on every workstation, it makes it harder to go from one machine to another machine. And so one compromise, the blast radius is just that machine, rather than these situations where people are using the same password across all the machines, which means the compromise of one means the compromise of all. So Microsoft provides a MMC fat console to go at these. Cayosoft adds a little web portal to that. So you can actually delegate and access a particular machine's password if you have permissions and if you install our web tool. And so this makes a great way to delegate at least privilege access to lapsed passwords that you will need to log into workstations or servers. And we provide this as a free component in our tool. I wanted to just quickly sort of go back and review what identity resilience means. I think you're all familiar with the concept, but we're using some terminology that may be new to you, and I think it's upon us to sort of make sure we're clearly defining this. So we look at identity resilience as an organization's ability to identify and remediate issues with user identities. It could be devices also, but in particular, we're looking at user identities or directories, and the organization's ability to sustain business continuity and availability should adverse events happen to those identities. I know it's kind of long-winded. What it means is, are you able to recover if something happens to your identities? And when we talk to our customers, oftentimes they'll say, yes, we have so-and-so backup vendor's backup solution, and they recover Active Directory. Well, that's probably not actually true. There are only 3 vendors on the planet today that can actually recover your entire Active Directory without the threat of reintroducing whatever compromise is there. There are very specific methods that are needed to be implemented, and just backing up a server and recovering it isn't enough. So resilience is simply if something happens, a breach, an outage, somebody makes a mistake or a malicious change, how resilient are you to that? And will you continue to operate, or can you get back into operation as quickly as possible? So let's first of all talk about the most common type of outage, and that's where somebody was able to go in as an administrator, and they're allowed to change your users, groups, computers, or the data attached to them. So not just delete a user account or a computer account, but maybe change the department name of a user. Well, in today's data-driven world, that may control which administrative scopes that particular object falls under. And it could shift from having very tight control with maybe a very select number of administrators to something that's more open, and suddenly anybody on the IT team could manage that. So for example, C-level accounts. You may have 1 or 2 people that are allowed to manage those CEO, CFO, CIO, CISO accounts, and you may put them in a special scope called executives. If somebody's able to change the department from executives or C-level, or maybe using the job title, they change it, that might switch it over to all employees, and now the general help desk can modify those. So just as a quick example, somebody does that, and then they reset the password on that account, and then they log into it. That's a problem. So that's kind of an example of a malicious change. If you have roles and you have rules and candidate memberships for those roles, and you provide scopes that are well thought out, you can eliminate most of that. But there will always be issues that you need to continuously monitor for or keep an eye out for. And good systems should alert you on those so that you see those quickly. And then you need some way to recover from those. So more likely it will be some sort of mistake. So, hey, add Joe Smith to this group so he can access a certain resource. Well, there could be a Joe Smith in the C-level org an executive, and there could be a Joe Smith that's responsible for buying widgets in the purchasing department. And if you get the wrong one, that could be an issue. So even those types of things should be looked at very carefully, and you need some way to roll those back. And remember, we're talking about object changes, not deletions. So you have the recycle bins that you can do, but keep in mind that object attributes are not covered by a recycle bin. And most of the mistakes or malicious changes to the data are done to attributes. So let me give you a quick example. We work with a healthcare organization, fairly large organization. Administrator ran a script and it updated group membership in a certain way, but it took out some people. And it happened to be that that was one of their Office 365 licensing groups. So on Saturday, help desk calls started coming in. 4,400 first responders had lost their ability to use Teams, to use Teams phone, to use their email. So they basically were cut off from communication. They actually were in POC with our tool, and it turned out it was a group membership. So they called our engineer, said, is there any way you can help? We took a look at our change log and said, oh, here's the problem. We saw that 4,400 people had been removed from that group. And so we just clicked restore in our tool, put it back. And within a couple of minutes, everybody had their licenses reassigned. And within 15 minutes or so, they had all of their resources back. Who keeps a printout or a record of all their group memberships? Wow. And because we had that extended visibility, it was easy for us to find. But it's typically object attribute changes or memberships that cause these kind of simple outages. They're really common. They happen all the time. And really, it's from unexpected changes. So again, roles, rules, scopes, applying least privileged concepts, you're pretty much good to go. But these can be hard to fix, and you need some way to roll them back. So it's typically going to be a third party. Microsoft Recycle Bin is just an undo delete. It's all it does. It doesn't roll things back. You want to roll those things back as quickly as possible so that you can right the ship, so to speak, or recover from those and be resilient to those sort of day-to-day changes. If you do have roles, rules, and scopes implemented, likely you would go in then and make sure to apply a rule that would prevent the happenstance that allowed that particular object to be changed, or the roles would be modified to eliminate that, or the scopes would be modified to eliminate that particular group from administrative scopes so that people like a normal person couldn't execute a change against it. If there are certain changes you never want to happen, there are ways to do automatic rollbacks. So for example, if there's some critically important object in Active Directory, admin SD holder, for example, you don't want any changes made to that, you could actually implement automatic rollback and prevent people from making those changes, or at least alert on them, or maybe alert on them and automatically roll them back. But it doesn't just apply to Active Directory on-premise. There are also things you want to really, really monitor and likely have automatic rollback for changes to things like admin units on the Azure side, your conditional access policy, your web application policies, your team security settings. All those are things that you really want to kind of keep an eye on. There's lots to do in a hybrid environment. So keeping an eye on those is pretty important. And some of those you can pretty much make the decision to decline or automatically roll back changes that happen. So there's a second kind of breach. With Zero Trust, you assume a breach, and those breaches often lead to a forest outage. All those items that we showed you back in slide 3, I think it was, that were all those corruptions or attacks, those were all complete outages of Active Directory. And on Active Directory on-premise, you have the forest. In the cloud, we call it your tenant. We're talking about forest outages here. So people roll along, they get into the environment, and they unleash a ransomware attack, which infects the operating system of your computers and puts up a little warning saying, hey, your server or your workstations have all been encrypted. Pay us a bunch of money and we'll give you back your data. We'll give you the decryption key. That's a pretty tough one to come back from if you aren't prepared up front. And if you have a traditional backup solution, Commvault, Veeam, they all claim Active Directory recovery. The problem is they're doing it as a snapshot or server-based or brick level backup. And so if you go to those types of backups and try to recover a workstation or a server, in this case, we're mostly concerned about servers because of the domain controllers, you're going to bring back the operating system, which is infected, and then suddenly your backup boots that new version of the machine and you get the same message again. It's been encrypted. So you want to look for one of the 3 recovery tools that just backs up the data in Active Directory and the components in Active Directory and leaves the operating system components behind, because you don't want to bring a ransomware attack or a wiper attack forward, so that you don't back up the infection as well. And again, as preemptive, zero trust identity administration, continuous change monitoring, and make sure you have a forest backup in terms of non-operating system or non-snapshot backup, so that you can bring back your entire forest if needed. Now, Microsoft does provide some help here. I want to say it's a 30 or 40 page document that gives guidance on how to do it. Hundreds of steps. It'll take you a week or a month, and you're going to likely not test it very often because it's so complicated. Again, there's 3 of those vendors out there. Cayosoft is one of them. I recommend highly that you look at those, because they're really the only good way to get out of a ransomware attack or whatever. And with a ransomware attack or a wiper attack, you have to bring back your Active Directory logins first. Otherwise, any other part of the recovery is kind of worthless, because all the security that's tied in from applications or data on your file servers or your print servers, all that relates back to a user identity in Active Directory. So the process is typically recover your identities first as a first response, then start to work on applications that may have also been on servers that are compromised. In those cases, you're probably going to have to choose, what's the latest backup I have that wasn't with that machine being infected. And often things like SQL backups and those things just get the data like we're doing with our forest recovery tool. So pretty good approach. Prepare for immediate or instant forest recovery. We know that time is money. And when you're out of business, you cease to operate. You want to get back into operation as quickly as possible. That'll reduce your costs and reduce the amount of data that you lose in the process. And again, Active Directory recovery, you really want to concentrate on just the components, not the servers themselves. But you will need to consider things like server names, because DNS is going to refer your users to, guess what? A bunch of SRV records that are going to point to the directory server where they're going to actually have their username and passwords checked, right? Their authentication and authorization requests are routed to. By the way, at Cayosoft, we do provide this solution. Reduces your overall cost of ownership. And I would also look at completeness of functionality. So you don't need 7 tools to have a good backup strategy for AD. You really just need one of these tools that will allow you to do both object and attribute recovery and these forest recoveries. Also, these tools out there enhance your SIEM solutions and help back up solutions as well. As I mentioned, hey, you can't do those server-based backups any longer because they carry the infection along. Your SIEM tool probably is going to do a pretty good job on finding most events and collecting those, except where somebody's messed with the events because they're trying to hide their tracks, or when events are unlogged, as the escalation of privilege change for Azure is not logged. And also event logs can be shut off easily or by mistake. So oftentimes to supplement those things, you're going to look for an observational change monitoring tool that detects all changes regardless of whether an event was created for it or messed with or not. So just keep that in mind. So as sort of the way we pay the bills, we're going to mention 3 little things about Cayosoft. We do provide management, monitoring, and recovery. And the 3 areas we really concentrate on are identity governance, identity administration, and identity resilience. And you'll see a couple of the bullet points here that we cover. But we provide for the identity administration piece one of the best, I think, zero trust implementations for at least the administration piece, the day-to-day administration piece, and then how do you recover from the breaches piece. So for the management and recovery. And the change auditing and visibility, we do have that as well. It's all built into our recovery tool. And it's really split down between 2 installations. One is our Cayosoft Administrator. That's really where we talk about implementing roles, rules, and scopes, along with just-in-time access, the temporal management, automatic group membership. And of course, everything's hybrid, so you kind of have a single unified approach to your security across all your Microsoft identities. And our second product is Cayosoft Guardian. That's the Zero Trust Identity Resilience product. It provides one product that gives you excellent change auditing with real-time alerting, provides object and attribute recovery, as well as full forest recovery in a single tool. Very efficient, etc. Thank you guys very much for taking time. I really appreciate it. I know this was a lot of information. If you have any additional questions, please let us know. I look forward to seeing you all on future webcasts. With that, I'm going to ask McKenna to walk us out.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. At this time, we'll go ahead and take attendance for the gift card drawing. If you are our lucky winner today, we will email you directly for more information. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. That concludes our presentation today. We'd like to again thank everyone for their time and hope you enjoyed the webinar. You'll see on the screen here a few quick links for the Cayosoft website. Should you have any additional questions, you can visit cayosoft.com/question. If you'd like to schedule a personalized demo or get your free trial, you'll see those links on the screen as well. And of course, for more information about Cayosoft and our solutions, feel free to visit cayosoft.com. Again, thank you so much for your time, and everyone have a great day.